PodCastle, episode 856 for Tuesday the 10th of September 2024. Tales from the Vaults. Clouds in a Clear Blue Sky by Matt Dovey. Read by Matthew James Hamblin. Produced by Peter Adrian Behravesh and Devin Martin. And rated PG-13, with content notes for grief and parental death. Hello, listeners of all species, and welcome to PodCastle, the flying castle of fantasy fiction. I'm your co-editor and host for this week, Eleanor R. Wood, and it's my pleasure to present for your enjoyment A Tale from the Vaults, Clouds in a Clear Blue Sky, by our very own Matt Dovey, narrated by Matthew James Hamblin. This story was originally published here at PodCastle as episode 667. Matt Dovey is very tall and very British, and although his surname rhymes with Dopey, all other similarities to the dwarf are only coincidence. He'd hoped for a more exciting midlife crisis than late autism and ADHD diagnoses, but turns out you don't get to choose. The scar on his arm is from an accident at the factory as a young'un. He lives in a quiet market town in rural England with his wife, 3 children, and varying quantities of cats and or dogs, and has been the host of PodCastle since 2022. He has fiction out and forthcoming all over the place. Keep up with it at mattdovey.com, because he's mostly sworn off social media. Mostly. Matthew James Hamblin is a screenwriter and video editor from Leeds, England. He has a penchant for good stories and a loose grasp of apostrophes. He owns a very cute dog named Bruce. And now pay attention, for our tale is about to begin. And if you squint just right, that one looks like a dragon with really short legs.
Clouds in a Clear Blue Sky by Matt Dovey. Read by Matthew James Hamblin. It were a clear blue day, what with the factory shut for the funeral and the wake. Colin was slumped in the pub garden swing, his straw hair sticking out every which way despite his mum's best efforts with the brill cream. Me and Trev were stood by quiet, our hands lost in the oversized pockets of our borrowed suits. Trev's cheeks had gone red and purple in the heat, his top button still done up and straining against his neck. Mark came back out the pub with a plate of sausage rolls that he offered round. "What's it like in there?" I asked. "Grim," said Mark. "Your Uncle Gareth's lost his jacket, and then he says it doesn't matter compared to losing Colin's dad, and then he starts crying again. Seen it happen 3 times while I were at the buffet." "Yeah, well," I said. "Best mates, weren't they?" Colin grunted, swung himself a bit harder, but said no. "Here, Colin," said Mark, holding the plate out. "Fancy a sausage roll?" Colin shrugged, carried on almost as if he hadn't heard aught. Then he got up and stomped to the picnic bench and drank his coat back in one go, and slammed the glass down so hard we all flinched thinking it'd smash. "This is shit! Really shit! Shit, shit, shit!" Well, there weren't much to say to that, really, 'cause he were right. So we stood and picked at the sausage rolls awkwardly. Colin stared us all in the face. "You know, they weren't even letting me see inside the casket. My own dad. I should have a right." "Colin, mate," said Trev, patting him on the shoulder as reassuring as he could. "If they didn't let you, it's for a reason. We all know what it's like in that factory. All sorts of dangerous stuff." "I don't know, though, do I? Not my 13th birthday till next month, so I ain't been shown round yet." Colin suddenly sniffed and wiped away an angry tear. He'd already got me my work boots. Found 'em in the bottom of his wardrobe this morning when I was looking for the shoe polish. "Oh, mate," I said. What? How to say anything that wouldn't sound like something we'd copied off our mums. "He'd have been proud for everyone in the factory to see you with him, and proud to show you round and have you see where he did his work, and everyone always said he was the best at cloud making, a real artist. You could always tell when your dad was on shift, 'cause the sunsets looked like bloody magic. Colin knew all that, and he'd know we meant it, but saying it out loud would sound stupid. There weren't no good way to say, Colin mate, this is shit, you don't deserve it, but we bloody love you and we'll get you through it, alright? 'Cause no matter how you said it, his head was too full of angry buzzing to hear. His head and his mouth both, and it kept spilling out even though he didn't mean it to. You what? He shouted. What, Jamie? What can you do? What can anyone bloody do? And I dunno. That's a question without an answer at times like this, I reckon. But before I knew it, my mouth had opened, and I'd answered anyway. We could show you round, Colin, us three. Show you where it worked, how to make the clouds. Mark looked up surprised. Trev near choked on his sausage roll. And Colin said, What? Well, I said, trying to work it out, 'cause I hadn't realised I was going to bloody say it, had I? There's no one up there today, right? They're all here in the pub, drinking to your dad. And we've all been up. And alright, I've only been a couple of times, but I reckon I can remember how my dad does the boiler controls, and Trev's dad works the furnace, and Mark's dad does the water inlets. So between us, we all sort of know all the main bits, right? And my dad got your dad to show me the cloud release lever, so I reckon we can get up there and let one cloud out, sort of, I don't know, a goodbye to your dad. Something he'd have appreciated. You know, something he can see from heaven. Colin sort of stared like he hadn't heard proper, then swallowed and nodded and looked away at the cloud factory. Its squat, lichen grey chimney stuck out halfway up the hillside, above the terraced houses and the railway station and the grass valley off down the way. The high street in town ran straight up the hill to the factory, but it were a good 20 minutes walk. Trev shook his head. I dunno if we'll make that before they notice we're gone, he said. He looked like he was sweating just at the thought of the climb. Mate, you've seen them indoors, I said. They ain't in a way to notice anything. When was the last time any of them came out to check on us? Yeah, but, said Mark, if they do find out, we won't ever get to go back. I got this whole speech off my dad about responsibility and good character, and showing you were sensible if you ever wanted a job up there. Aye, I got that, said Trev. I don't reckon breaking into the factory'd look good, Jamie. I know, I said. I had it for my dad too. But we've got to do summat for Colin, haven't we? We'll not be long at it. One cloud. I couldn't back out now I'd said it. No matter how uncertain I felt or how worried I was at being caught. Let's just go, said Colin, grabbing the last handful of sausage rolls. I'll tell them it were my idea if anyone stops us. I don't care. There's naught they can do to me that's worse than what's already happening. He pushed through the wooden gate and set off up the hill, and that didn't leave no choice for the rest of us but to follow him. It's locked, said Trev, pulling at the double door handles, as if the chain might fall off if he shook it just right. All of us were sweating in our funeral suits from climbing in the sun, and our posh shoes were chafing at our heels, and we walked all this way for notes. There's got to be a key somewhere, I said, or another door or something. Any of you going another way? Trev shrugged and leant against the corrugated steel wall, ready to give it up, and Mark jogged up the factory front a ways to look, but there were only the big roller doors, and the switch for them were on the inside. I don't even know who'd have the key, said Mark. I can't remember 'em ever shutting down before, not properly with everyone out like this. Even Christmas has a few on quiet shift. Don't matter, said Colin, defeated. It were a stupid idea anyway. He kicked the doors in frustration, rattling the chain. No, I said. Hearing how beaten he was then made my mind up. No, we're getting in. Think. Who'd have the key? I dunno, said Trev. Who owns the factory? I dunno, said Mark. Not really thought about it before, I suppose. Someone's got to have a key, I guess. Is there an office around here or something? Only Uncle Gareth's booth at the gate, I said. Wouldn't he have the key? Asked Mark. If he's security, it must be his job to lock up. He'll have it on him though, said Trev. Except, I ran over to the small wooden booth, hoping, peering through the mucky glass. Yes! You said he'd lost his jacket in the pub, right, Mark? He left it here. I pulled open the door and patted down the pockets, pulling out a bunch of keys and holding them up triumphant. We were really going to do it then. Best hope we didn't get caught and muck our lives up forever in one afternoon. We ran to the factory door, suddenly worried about getting seen, even though we'd been knocking around for about 10 minutes already. We all yanked at the door chains to unravel them, and then piled in, trying to squeeze through the open door at the same time. The factory was still. There were no one bustling about between levels and levers, no valves spinning or belts moving or anything at all. Only a warm, low hum, and a scent that burned your nostrils to let you know none of it was sleeping, just waiting. It's massive, said Colin, staring up in awe at the main boiler and the chimney above. I never knew it was so big. Right, I said. Cloud making, here we go. Colin, you and me'll go up that ladder there. Where do you two need to be? Mark gestured to the far wall, against the hillside. The inlets are over there if we need more water from the springs. Did you know there's pipes all over the hills? Me and Dad go walking when he's got the weekend off. We're trying to see 'em all. Trev cut in before Mark got carried away. Furnace is down below, he said, wiping the sweat off his brow. It was hot in here even without everything going. Don't reckon as you'll hear me over there if I need to shout you, I said. So you two hang about here while me and Colin check up top. We'll let you know if we need more Vault, I guess. Alright? Yeah, alright, said Trev, who sat down on the walkway in relief, leaning against a railing. Mark shrugged in agreement and started looking round, curiosity keeping him busy. Come on then, I said to Colin, setting off for the ladder. I stood back when we got there so he could go first. My dad had done that the same for me when he brought me in, like he knew I'd chicken out if he went first and I had to follow. So he stood back as if there were no doubt in his mind that I could do it, and that gave me the courage because I didn't want to let him down. I didn't know if it had worked the same between Colin and me, but I guess we all had to fill in there and hope now. It's pretty high, he said dubiously. Aye, it's not so bad once you go in. I left it at that, trying to keep casual. After a moment he took to the ladder, and I thought of telling him how proud I was of him, but I figured he'd not appreciate drawing attention to it, so I just waited a space of breaths and went up after. Not that I were thrilled about climbing it myself, mind you. We gave each other a careful nod at the top, enough to let on that both of us were glad to be done with it, without letting on we'd actually been frightened, even though it were okay to be frightened, because it were really bloody high after all. This is where my dad would have worked, asked Colin, looking about the platform circling the boiler. Aye, I said, nodding at the cloud lever. He'd have been there working the release. He was both times I visited. Sat quiet, focusing, like he were listening to the clouds through the handle. He had a little bubble of calm around him, like all the other blokes went respectful when they got near so as they didn't disturb him. Reckon they all thought a lot of him, mate. Reckon they loved him a lot. He stared at the handle. I gave him his piece and went to my dad's spot. There were more dials than I remembered. He'd made it look simple, pointing out which ones meant Colin's dad had the all clear for a cloud release. But sat here without him, they all looked the same. A good dozen of them actually identical. And could I bloody remember which ones he'd said were important? They were all still, though, pointed in different directions, so I figured the system were primed and left sitting in balance. I looked over the labels stuck down on the red iron control board, lined up beneath each dial. They were all shortened and most of them made no sense, but boiler purser and water tump were clear enough, and I figured the thick black line 3/4 round were the sweet spot. We needed a bit more of both. I went to the rail and shouted down to Mark and Trev. We need more heat, and we need more pressure, I yelled, my voice clanging off all the iron and pipes in the factory. How much? Shouted Trev. I dunno. A bit? How much is a bit? The needle on the dial ain't that far off. How much does that mean? I dunno. Just give it a bit, alright? And Mark, turn the water on too. Go easy on both of them. If it's not enough, we can give it more after, alright? Yeah, alright, shouted Trev, who trundled off to the ladder that had taken him down a level. Mark ran off down the walkways to the far wall, where all the inlet valves were set in a row. When I turned back, Colin was by the cloud release lever, resting his hand on top, biting his bottom lip. How do you reckon he died then? He asked as I walked up. Honestly, mate, I haven't a clue. I dunno as I need to know either. What he did while he were alive is more important, right? Do you reckon he was stood here when it happened? Whatever happened. Colin, seriously. I reached a hand out for him and he swiped it away. I almost walked away and left him to it, thinking he needed the space, but then I figured he needed the support more, and pulled him in for a hug. It were awkward for a moment. Not something mates normally do, is it? But it felt like it helped, I reckon. Come on, mate. Let's go see if Mark and Trev have done their bit yet. Then we can send this cloud up, yeah? Your dad showed me how the handle worked, so I'll show you, and I reckon that's sorta like your dad showing you then, aye? Aye, Colin said. Aye. The water and pressure dials had both lifted, and were more or less bang on now. Mark and Trev might not look like much some days, but they'd done the job right and we were set to go. Here I was hoping I could do my part so well. Might be the only time I ever did it after all if we got caught. Right, I said to Colin. When I give you the nod, ease back on the lever to build pressure in the cloud chamber. Then, when it's built up enough, you squeeze the handle to let it out of the chimney. How do I know when the pressure's right? I tried to remember when I'd had a go. I dunno, to be honest. Your dad told me when to squeeze. It were a count of 10 after pulling back on the lever, if that helps. Colin nodded and gripped the lever, his jaw set. He was set to do his dad proud. Now I had to do my bit. The dials were all shifting now, not just the boiler pressure and water temperature. I didn't have a clue what SBTK3PR was, nor any of the other SBTKs around it, but I figured it weren't good by how much they were dropping. Reckoned we needed to do this fast, then shut it all down before it got dangerous. I tried to remember which levers my dad had used to pass the steam into the cloud chamber. There was air mix and PodCastle and aperture and pre-temp and all sorts. And I reckon I used them all last time, but God knows how much I'd done them. I were too carried away with doing it to notice what I were doing. Aperture and pre-temp were somewhere in the middle anyway, so I figured they were right. Best not to mess with the other two, because I didn't have the foggiest what PodCastle were, and I didn't know how much air I should mix in. So I eased up on puzzer release and watched for the pressure dial to drop as I let steam out of the main boiler, because it were getting frightful close to that red mark. One of the other dials, Atmo Cham, started to rise, so I figured that were Colin's chamber, and I pulled back on my lever to stop feeding it. The main pressure dial hardly dropped at all. Reckoned it had stopped climbing for a moment, but no more. We'd have to get this cloud out, then run down to Trev and Mark and get them to wind back the boiler and the tank before everything got too much. Right! I shouted to Colin, because everything were clanking and rattling now, and I had to yell to make myself heard even over the space of 10 foot. Give it a go! He nodded, jaw clenched, and pulled back on the lever. I could see him struggle as the Atmo chain needle climbed. And I reckon that was how Colin's dad felt the pressure, through the lever. The dial were getting pretty high, so I shouted, "Now!" But between his concentration and the racket going on, I don't know as he heard me. And he kept heaving back on the lever, using both hands now, his arms trembling and his brow sweating in the muggy heat of the factory. The dial I was looking at had climbed well into the red by the time he squeezed the handle. I felt it through the floor. Everything sort of hiccuped, and the lever jerked in his hand, and a cough of cloud shot out the chimney. I could see it through the grill over my head, a view of the blue sky and the chimney above. That cloud fair shot out, and another followed it, and another, as Colin struggled with the lever, struggled to hold it steady and squeeze the handle smooth like. There were a whole procession of cloud puffs coming out, and everything inside shook when each were released, and it weren't nothing like the gentle squeezing I'd seen from Colin's dad. The lever were bucking and kicking in his hands, fighting him, and I could see Colin getting upset like he were failing his dad. I glanced at the dials, and it were all bad news, but I couldn't shut it down so Colin had a good cloud out. We'd gone through all this, and he'd never get over it if he didn't pull it off. He'd always feel like he'd let his dad down, no matter how much we told him that were nonsense. So, I ran over, and I grabbed the lever for him, holding it steady so he could concentrate on the handle. And bloody hell it weren't easy. Damn thing were trying to right itself like a pole in river mud, and I had to hook an elbow around it to hold it steady. Colin took a deep breath, and with both hands, squeezed the handle at the top smooth and gentle, easing the chimney vent open to let the cloud out, up to the sky, to float on in memory of his dad, for as long as it would. Then the handle slipped from his fingers, the vent snapped shut, and the lever yanked me forward and shot back upright. "I can't do it!" he shouted, tears of frustration running into the sweat pouring from his forehead. "I'm not my dad, I ain't got the knack, and I won't ever get the chance to learn it now he's gone!" He kicked the lever. It barely moved. "There's too much pressure!" I yelled, everything up here still making a right old racket. "If we can find a way to ease it off, we can do it right." Colin wiped his forehead on the back of his sleeve, the cuff streaked with muck, and we went over to my dad's station, where all the dials were telling us things we didn't want to know. Near everything were in the red, except the things that had dropped a note, and everything looked right out of whack. I didn't know what most of it meant, but boiler pressure was still rising. "Colin, go tell Trevor and Mark to shut off what they're doing. That's when everything started climbing, when I got them to do their bit, so if they stop, it'll give us some breathing room." Colin looked at the ladder. "No, I'll stay here and watch the dials. You know your way around better than I do. You'll find them quicker." "Mate, it's just a ladder. I know it's right high, I don't much like it either, but I know you can do this. I've got to sort these levers out. I've seen my dad working before. Go down and shout for Mark and Trev, and you'll find them easy enough." I didn't tell him how worried I was that something up here were about to explode, and how I didn't want his mam dealing with the grief of losing him too. He'd drag me down the ladder if he thought there were any danger of that happening. But I was determined to see this through and get him his cloud. This was important. I set myself to working out the dials and levers. There had to be a way to let some of the pressure out somewhere, something with vent in the name, or release. There was a lever on the right labelled Atmo vent, so I pulled back on that one. The needle on the Atmo chamber drops a note, and the needle on boiler puzzer went up even higher, and the air suddenly filled with ringing of bells. I froze, and all the letters on all the labels looked jumbled up all of a sudden, and I couldn't make no sense of them. I didn't want to press the wrong thing again and make it even worse, but I had to do summit, but I had no idea what. And so this is how I was going to die, I realised. Me and the Cloud Factory, and the lads downstairs too, maybe. And it were all my stupid idea, 'cause I wanted to do something good for Colin. Something that'd make this day a bit easier on him. And now, well, I dunno. I didn't know nothing then, 'cause my head were filled with the noise of the alarm bells ringing, and my legs were locked like stone, and there were naught I would have known how to do anyway, I suppose. Then my dad was there, pulling on levers, pushing on others, tapping dials and reaching down to wind a handle I hadn't even noticed. The needles all started moving back to the centre, settling down or lifting themselves up, and the bells cut out, and I swear I ain't never felt so relieved, and guilty, and sorry, and rotten as when my dad turned round to look at me then, his face all mixed up with anger and relief and I dunno what else. "Down the ladder," he said, voice as angry as I've ever heard it, then or since. "Now." And there weren't no arguing with that. The other lads were standing with their dads, and Colin looked awkward on his own, and guilty, and I could tell he were feeling like a failure, even though it were me that had failed him, not doing my part right with the pressure. "What's going on then?" asked Mark's dad of mine as we walked up. "Go on then, Jamie," said my dad turning to me. "Tell us all. What the bloody hell were you playing at?" I nearly cried then, not 'cause I were ashamed of what we'd done, but because I needed to say this right, so he understood that we weren't just mucking about, we weren't just being kids, it were for something important. 'Cause maybe, if he understood that, he'd not think we'd been irresponsible and stupid, and we'd not get stopped from coming to the factory, and maybe he'd see how important it was too, and maybe he'd do something about it. I drew myself up and looked him square in the eye. It were for Colin, I said. For his dad, to make him proud. And it took a moment to go through. But then my dad grabbed me and pulled me in and hugged me close and kept muttering in my ear, "You daft bastards. You utter daft bastards." Turned out, all three dads, mine, Trev's, and Mark's, had noticed us missing from the beer garden. And when they saw the clouds coughing out the chimney, raced up the hill in Trev's dad's Cortina. And turns out it were just in time, 'cause them alarms were bad news. And if my dad hadn't diverted some of the pressure into the sub-tanks, bits would have started cracking open, and super hot steam would have filled the place, and well, there wouldn't have been much left of out after that. "Why'd you bring him up yourselves?" asked Trev's dad of us. "'Cause, Dad," said Trev, "he ain't seen the factory afore. His dad were meant to bring him next month." "We was gonna work it out so he could let off a cloud," said Mark, words tripping over themselves as they fell out of his mouth. "In memory like, it were only going to be the one, honest. I dunno what happened to go so wrong. We were dead gentle with all the levers and that. I only turned the one inlet on, and Trev didn't put that much heat in, and maybe I turned a second inlet on when naught seemed to be happening because I thought it'd help, but it didn't seem to make it better at all when I did." "Why'd you put more water in?" my dad asked. "Well, the dials weren't high enough, were they?" I said. "Neither pressure nor temperature. I figured it wouldn't do no good if they weren't both at the mark." "Oh, Jamie, you silly bugger," said my dad. "You turn up the temperature and the pressure goes up too, 'cause the boiler fills with steam. You only needed a little heat. It had enough water in as it were." "Oh," I said, and looked down glum. I didn't realise. It really had been me who mucked it up for Colin. "You silly sods," said Trev's dad. "You should have said. You should have talked to us before you got into all this trouble." My dad looked at Mark's and Trev's then, and he looked like he were deciding something, and I couldn't tell if it were what punishment we deserved, or who to tell, or what. So I just said, "Please, Dad," and trusted that he knew what I was asking for. Who I was asking for. He looked down at me then, and back at the other dads, and then he said, "Right, boys, are we good to do this?" "Aye, I reckon," said Mark's dad. "What kind of cloud do you want to let out then, Colin?" Colin looked up disbelieving. "What's them right big buggers, Dad?" asked Mark, already excited. "The ones that make the sky go all black and gold and make your hair stand on end and give you the lightning. It ought to be something dramatic for Colin's dad." "Yeah, I know 'em," said Trev. "Cumulonimbus." "Cumulonimbus," corrected his dad. "Typical lads. Straight to the top, eh? Too bloody big, though." "Aye," agreed Mark's dad, smiling wryly. "What?" I said, angry. "You don't think Colin's dad was worth all the water? You think we'd be wasting it?" I glared at them all in turn, challenging them, ending on my dad. "Jamie," he said, "it'd be worth all the water in the hills if we could boil it all at once. But it ain't about the water, it's about the layers. Cloud like that's got structure to it, and I don't know as any of us here have the knack. Truth be told, I don't reckon anyone but Colin's dad had the right of cumulonimbus. There weren't no one else with his touch, Colin. You should be proud of him." Colin swallowed and nodded. "I am. I mean." Trev's dad pulled him close with an arm round his shoulder. "You said it right first time, lad." Mark's dad said, "What about some cumulus humilis then? None of us'll manage the consistency like Colin's dad did. But there's not much cheers the heart like row upon row of the little fluffy bastards at sunset." "What are the feathery ones?" asked Colin. "Feathery ones?" said Mark's dad. "How do you mean exactly?" They're high up and long and with that little flick on the end. Dad's always said he was proudest of them, because they were gentle and subtle and not so showy, except if you knew what you were looking for, you could appreciate the artistry. Said a couple of them made a glorious sunset, high enough to catch the colour once the sun dipped down. My dad whistled inwardly, sucking the air through his front teeth. "Cirrus uncinus, eh? They're tricky buggers. Not much can happen if you get 'em wrong, I suppose. It'll take you a few goes before you get it, but if you're willing to try, Colin, we'll have a crack." Me, said Colin. You want me to make 'em? Well, said my dad, that was the whole point, weren't it? There weren't any prep work needed doing, what with us having filled the system near bursting point, so we all headed up the ladder, Dad's behind lads, Colin before me again. My dad showed me where I'd gone wrong, and taught me through what he were doing, moving steam and water between the sub-tanks and the main boiler, and how he'd keep a constant supply of steam available by feeding the atmospheric chamber from one sub-tank while he refilled another. Like circular breathing when you're on the tuba, he said, till I reminded him Mum hadn't agreed I could practice for the brass band yet. But Colin said he got it, and my dad nodded at him, and I could see Colin swell up like a growing cloud. Once the sub-tanks were ready, Mark's dad took over at the controls so my dad could show Colin the handle. He'd worked closest with Colin's dad, been on the top platform with him, and he knew somewhat of how to shape the clouds, though not as sharp as Colin's dad had been. In his own words, weren't no one else had the skill. I stood underneath the grill and watched the clouds come out as my dad and Colin worked together, easing the lever back nice and smooth. There was still some resistance to it, but it weren't fighting them like earlier. When they squeezed the handle, it weren't just about letting the cloud out. It were about working the handle, sometimes squeezing more and sometimes less, and balancing it with the lever to give the cloud its shape. You could see it as they finished each cloud. They'd only pull the lever back a little ways as they made them, keep lots of pressure in the system to make the clouds thin and high, and hold the release handle steady until right at the end, when they'd pull the handle tighter and haul back on the lever at the same time to give it a little kick out the chimney and put the tail on the end. Took them 2 or 3 clouds to get that motion right, but once they had it, they were away. They were proper away. We were all laid out on the slope outside the factory, our suits covered in dry summer grass. We were looking westward down the valley as the sun turned red, and Colin's clouds lit up in gold and crimson. Not a word passed between us as we watched the clouds drift towards the sun. The sun touched the horizon exploded in bursts of starlings dancing through the air. It all looked and smelt and sounded like summer, like a job well done, like family. And not just the family of being related, the family of being in town and looking out for one another, and doing right. "That were good work, Colin," said Trev's dad, a cigarette hanging between his fingers. Your dad himself would have been proud of clouds like that. "So then, Colin," said my dad, "you alright if I bring you up for factory days from here on out? We've been discussing it in the pub anyhow, but seeing the hand you've got for clouds now, it'd be criminal not to have you working up there come 5 years. "Aye," said Colin. "Aye, course I am." He stood up in the excitement of it, and my dad couldn't help but laugh. "Alright, calm down, we're not going back in now. We'll work some out. Have to see how I'll balance it round my Jamie's days up there." "We're not banned from the factory then?" asked Trev. Hardly daring to believe, I reckon. "Banned?" asked his dad. "Why do you think that?" "'Cause you all told us," said Mark, "about having to show we was responsible and sensible if we wanted jobs." "Way I see it," said my dad, considering, "you were all being responsible for your mate, and looking out for him. That's important, that is, and I'm proud of you all. So no, apart from you lot needing to talk to us better in the future, my only problem is working out a rota for Colin." "Can't you show us both at the same time?" I asked. "Not yet, no. I'd prefer only having one of you to keep an eye on at a time, especially after seeing what happens when you end up unsupervised." He wrapped his big hand around the back of my neck and shook me playfully, smiling. "I reckon we can all weigh in there," said Trev's dad. "Aye, I don't see why not," said Mark's dad. "If he's going to be a cloud hand up top, it'd serve him best to know how the whole factory works anyway. Get an understanding of the whole process like." "Sound alright to you, Colin?" asked Trev's dad. Colin nodded, near dancing on the spot. "Come on then," said my dad, hauling himself up off the slope. "We best get back down to the pub. Every bugger will be wondering where we've got to, and Gareth will be singing soon if we don't get him home. Ain't no one deserves to suffer that." We pulled ourselves up in 2s and 3s, lending hands and brushing off grass, and casting last glances down the valley, then set off back for town. The evening were warm with not a hint of breeze, so Trev's dad left his Cortina parked up and we all walked back down the hill in the last light of sunset, laughing and teasing and talking together. and I don't know if Colin noticed or not, but we all made sure he was safely in the middle as we walked, surrounded and watched over, and part of us all.
And welcome back. That was Clouds in a Clear Blue Sky by Matt Dovey, and if you enjoyed that, well, there's a wealth of Matt's stories to be found all across the EA podcasts, including 4 more right here at PodCastle. Episode 653, Why Aren't Millennials Continuing Traditional Worship of the Elder Dark? Episode 578, The Bone Poet and God? Episode 484, which includes Matt's flash story Winter Witch, and episode 427, Squalor and Sympathy, which ran again last year as one of our anniversary specials. If that's not enough to keep you going, you can find more of Matt's fabulous work at mattdovey.com. September 7th was International Day of Clean Air for Blue Skies, a day I think we can all agree is one to aspire to. When I was planning this month's Tales from the Vaults theme, that day stood out immediately as A, worth noting, and B, with the perfect story waiting patiently in the vaults for its moment to shine again. I'll confess right at the outset that I adore this story. I've adored it from the moment I first got to read an early draft. Matt and I have critiqued each other's stories for many years. And I was so chuffed when it found its first home here at PodCastle under the previous editors Jen and Sheree, when Matt and I were both still slogging it out down in the slush mines. This story embraces its Britishness in a way few stories do in the speculative genres. It's a glimpse of growing up in a very specific era in Britain, and it leans into its working class themes with honesty and gentle pride. Matthew Hamblin's narration is utterly spot on in bringing it to life, and there are so many small details, the sausage rolls, the Ford Cortina, that just ground you immediately in this time and place. But what this one has to say about love, friendship, compassion, and caring for each other, despite the lingering era of toxic masculinity in which it's set, is what clinches it as one of my favourite stories to fly from these castle ramparts. This is a story without a single female character amongst its relatively large cast, and for once that choice is deliberate, well considered, and thematically perfect. Because this story would not have the crucial impact it has if one of the kids was a girl, or if one of the parents was a mum. This story's power and its impact stem from the fact that it is, in its entirety, a story about male humans caring for each other, showing one another genuine sympathy and compassion, loving each other in purely platonic, familial, and honest ways. It's a story that rips up the lies of toxic masculinity, the lies which say compassion is weakness, and love can only be sexual, and wanting to hug your grieving friend is wrong, and throws them roundly into the dustbin where they belong. It's a story that proves all of those things are, in fact, strengths. Strengths that make you a better person, a better dad, a better friend. Strengths that without a doubt make the world a better place. Our current era seems presently dominated by weak men in power who think shows of aggression and dominance disguise their pathetic fears of inadequacy. They don't. They simply show them up as the craven bullies they are. Warmongering, genocide, and blustering lies are not strength. Sympathy, kindness, and a willingness to acknowledge your vulnerabilities for the benefit of others, those are true strengths. Transformative powers indeed, with the ability to make the world a better place for us all. That was our show for this week. On behalf of everyone at PodCastle, your co-editors Shingai and Jerry Kagunda and myself, Eleanor R. Wood, assistant editor Caitlin Zavanovich, your usual host, Matt Dovey, audio engineers Devin Martin and Eric Valdez, and our many wonderful first readers: Andrew Cahoe, Craig Jackson, Amalia Harrington, Julia Patt, Kieran Corsini, Ryan Cole, Sarah S. Messenger, Sri Kripa Krishna Prasad, Tava Nova, Tierney Bailey, and Zeev Witties. The Legal Bit, PodCastle, is part of the Escape Artists Foundation, a 501c3 non-profit, and this episode is distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. That means you can share it, and please do. But you cannot sell it and you cannot change it. If you want specifics, check out creativecommons.org. Our music is by Shiva in Exile. Everything we do on PodCastle is 100% donor funded, and if you'd like to support what we and the rest of EA do, please join us on our Patreon at patreon.com/EAPodcasts. If you prefer another method, there's details for supporting us via Twitch, Amazon Prime, Ko-fi and PayPal on escapeartists.net. We will be back next Tuesday with another fantastic tale. In the meantime, you might care to check out our sister podcasts, Escape Pod for science fiction, Pseudopod for horror, Cast of Wonders for YA speculative fiction, and Cat's Cast for speculative cat stories. If your heart belongs to us, though, we'll see you next week. Be safe and be kind.